Welcome to the deep dive. Ready for a fascinating journey into evolutionary psychology with us today? We'll be diving into Matt Ridley's The Red Queen, Sex and the Evolution of Human Nature. It's amazing to think that behaviors we see today might actually have roots in, the distant past.
Yeah, it's a real trip back in time to uncover how evolution has shaped our minds and actions in ways we probably don't even realize.
Okay, so let's jump in. Ridley spends some time on this idea of the selfish gene. Kind of unsettling, right? This concept that we're just vehicles for our genes and they just want to survive. Does that, leave any room for free will?
Yeah, it really makes you think, but I don't think the selfish gene idea necessarily gets rid of free will. It's more like it suggests that our motivations and behaviors are influenced by this deep drive to pass on our genes, sort of like an underlying program subtly nudging us in certain directions.
So it's this tug of war between our genes and our choices.
Yeah.
But okay, if passing on genes is so important, why even bother with sex? Asexual reproduction would be way more efficient, wouldn't it?
Right, you'd think so. But sex is still here. Ridley goes into several theories that try to explain this mystery. One that really stands out is the Red Queen hypothesis. It basically says that sexual reproduction, it's like an arms race against parasites that are constantly evolving.
So we're always mixing up our genes just to stay ahead of these tiny enemies. It's kind of terrifying, but also really smart. Are there any, real-world examples of this Red Queen effect?
There is. Ridley talks about this study of water snails in New Zealand. It's pretty compelling evidence. Snails in environments with tons of parasites were more likely to reproduce sexually. So it supports that idea that sex helps species stay ahead in this evolutionary game.
Wow. That's a powerful example of how our environment shapes our biology. But if it's all about, survival of the fittest, where does cooperation come in? Wouldn't selfish genes just make a dog-eat-dog world?
That's where it gets really fascinating. Evolutionary psychology recognizes this tension between cooperation and competition, even at the genetic level. Sometimes genes actually benefit from working together, even if it means giving up a little individual advantage.
So it's not always a free-for-all. Are there any, examples of these cooperative genes in action?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's quite a few, actually. But sometimes, you get these rogue genes that try to game the system. Ridley mentions a fascinating one. It's called the Medea gene. It's in flower beetles. And this gene, it's a ruthless strategy. It basically kills off any offspring that don't inherit it.
It's like a genetic soap opera
Mm-hmm.
with all the betrayals and alliances. Speaking of drama, what about the battle of the sexes? Did that come from this interplay of cooperation and competition too?
Absolutely. Ridley suggests that the fact that we have two sexes at all could be from a conflict between different types of genes in our cells. See, our cells have DNA, not only in the nucleus, but also in our mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell.
Wait, so there's a power struggle even at the subcellular level? What does that even mean for us, this genetic tug of war?
I know, it's wild, right? This conflict, Ridley calls it the gender wars, it might have led to two sexes as a way to resolve the tension and ensure both types of genes survive.
That changes how I think about gender. But if that conflict caused the evolution of two sexes, how do we actually become male or female? I mean, there's so many different ways gender is expressed in nature.
That's true. There's this amazing variety in sex determination mechanisms across different species. Like, we're familiar with the X and Y chromosome thing, but with some reptiles, the temperature their eggs are incubated at, that decides their sex. Imagine that.
It's incredible how flexible nature can be. Are there any other unusual sex determination examples?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Ridley brings up this slime mold that has 13 genders, which really, pushes our understanding of gender. And then there's this case of an all-female family in France. Their genes seem to be breaking the typical rules of sex determination.
13 genders. That's amazing.
Yes.
Biology is just full of surprises. But let's get back to humans for a sec. How does evolutionary psychology explain all the different mating systems we see in human societies, like monogamy and polygamy?
It comes down to this balance between quantity and quality of mates. Ridley says that things like resource availability, social status, and even the need for paternal care, they all play a role in whether a species is more likely to be polygamous or monogamous.
So there's no one right way to mate. What are the like the trade-offs of choosing a specific mating strategy?
Exactly. It's always a trade-off. For instance, if resources are scarce and a father's help is really important for raising kids, then monogamy might be the best way to go. But in societies where males contribute less to like childcare, polygamy might be more common.
So basically, evolution just goes for whatever gives those genes the best shot at survival. Are there any examples in human history that illustrate that?
Definitely. Ridley talks about this thing called the polygyny threshold. It's basically the point where, for a female, it's actually better to be, the second wife of a high-status guy with lots of resources, rather than the only partner of someone who doesn't have as much to offer. It helps explain why polygamy is still around in some cultures, even though monogamy, seems to have its advantages.
So it's not always about love and romance, huh? Sometimes it's about survival and security. It's like this cost-benefit analysis for relationships. But let's switch gears a bit. What about intelligence? Is our big brain, is that also a product of this drive to reproduce?
It's a great question. Ridley actually challenges the toolmaker myth. The idea that intelligence evolved just for using tools. He talks more about the social brain hypothesis, which says our intelligence evolved to handle, how complex our social world is.
So instead of like outsmarting nature, we had to outsmart each other. That sounds kind of Machiavellian.
Well, Ridley does get into that, the idea of Machiavellian intelligence, that our brains evolved to deceive and manipulate and outmaneuver others in our social groups. It's like this constant mental chess match.
Kind of unsettling. Makes you wonder if we're all just like pawns in this evolutionary game.
Yeah.
But if our big brains are for social strategy, what about things like um, creativity and storytelling? Those seem more about self-expression, not survival.
That's where it gets really interesting. Ridley suggests that even those seemingly higher human qualities might have evolved, at least partly, as forms of sexual selection. Think about it. A good storyteller, someone who can like really captivate an audience, might be seen as more intelligent, more interesting, and ultimately more desirable as a mate.
So Shakespeare was just trying to like impress a potential mate with his sonnets.
Well, maybe not consciously, but the idea is that those traits that make us, more attractive to the opposite sex, like wit, creativity, even a knack for storytelling, those could have been selected for over time. Ridley compares it to those, elaborate courtship displays in the animal world. It's all about standing out from the crowd, showing off your best stuff.
Like birds doing those crazy mating dances. But what about differences between men and women's brains? Is that nature or nurture?
Ridley looks at the evidence for sex differences in the brain, especially how hormones like testosterone influence development. He mentions studies that show that men, on average, do better on spatial tasks like mental rotation, while women are better at, verbal fluency and social perception.
So there are real biological differences. But does that mean we're like hardwired to act certain ways? Are men just doomed to be bad communicators and women forever lost with a map?
Not necessarily. Ridley makes it clear that, even if there are biological predispositions, culture and learning are hugely important too. It's not as simple as biology is destiny. It's more like this complex interplay between our genes and our environment.
So even if men might be like predisposed to be better at spatial stuff, that doesn't mean every man's going to be a master navigator and every woman isn't, going to be a brilliant poet, even if they're wired for verbal fluency. It's good to know we're not just at the mercy of our genes.
Uh-huh.
What about sexual orientation? How does evolutionary psychology address that?
That's a fascinating area. Ridley points out that studies on homosexuality can actually help us understand how testosterone affects brain development. There's more and more evidence for a genetic component to sexual orientation, which challenges that whole idea that, how you're raised is the only thing that determines your preferences.
So even something as personal as sexual orientation could be rooted in our evolutionary history.
It seems that way. It speaks to, just how incredibly complex the relationship between biology and behavior is. But let's move on to something else interesting. Beauty. Everyone has different ideas about what's beautiful, so how can we even talk about the evolution of beauty? You're right, beauty standards are all over the place, different cultures, different times. But Ridley thinks there might be some underlying universal principles going on. He looks at how things like facial symmetry, a healthy waist to hip ratio, even how average a face looks, those things might signal health and fertility, and that could subconsciously influence who we're attracted to.
So even when we think we're into someone for their personality or their sense of humor, Our biology might be saying something else entirely.
Possibly. These features might be like subtle cues hinting at, good genes and the potential for healthy kids. It's not like we're consciously calculating these things, but evolution might be, kind of nudging us in a certain direction.
That's wild. But if those beauty cues are biological, how come beauty standards change so much? What's hot in one era or culture can be, like, totally different in another.
And that's where the Red Queen pops up again. Just like with that parasite arms race, beauty standards are always evolving too. As certain features become, more common, the bar for attractiveness goes up, leading to this escalating competition for attention and desirability.
It's like a fashion treadmill, always trying to keep up with the latest trends.
Exactly. And this applies to, not just looks, but also things like personality and intelligence. As our environment changes, as we face new challenges, the qualities that make a partner desirable, they shift too. It's a really fascinating dynamic process.
So it's not enough to just look good. You got to have the brains and the personality go with it. But how does evolutionary psychology explain what we find attractive in someone's,
Yeah.
personality? I mean, some people are drawn to dominance, while others prefer kindness or a good sense of humor.
That's a good point. Ridley suggests that these personality preferences could also be signaling some underlying evolutionary advantages. Like dominance might be attractive because it suggests leadership potential, the ability to provide resources. Kindness, on the other hand, that could signal, good parenting qualities and a willingness to cooperate. And humor, well, that might be a sign of intelligence and creativity.
So we're not just picking partners based on, like, surface level stuff. We're subconsciously checking out their potential as parents and providers. It's like a primal interview process.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And it all goes back to that basic drive to choose mates who will, help us successfully pass on those genes.
This is making me rethink my whole dating strategy. But it's not just about romantic relationships, right?
Mhm.
Evolutionary psychology can, like, shed light on all kinds of human behavior.
Absolutely. For example, it can help us understand parental care, sibling rivalry, even why we tend to form these social hierarchies. The principles of evolutionary psychology can apply to, a wide range of human experiences.
So even the things we just, like, take for granted every day have these deep evolutionary roots.
Exactly. And by understanding those roots, we can appreciate just how complex human nature really is and the forces that have made us who we are.
It's humbling and maybe a little scary to think about how much our past still, like, influences our present. We're just scratching the surface here. Let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, and then we'll come back and explore some of the bigger implications of evolutionary psychology. It really is amazing to think about all these, like, hidden forces shaping our lives.
Yeah, and what's so cool is how Ridley, he ties together all these seemingly random things, like how sexual selection, it's not just about looks, it also affects how intelligence evolved, creativity, even our sense of, morality.
It's mind-blowing how much our mating preferences have shaped, well, everything. What about for you listening? Anything from this deep dive into evolutionary psychology really sticking with you?
One thing that really got me thinking was how our modern minds are still carrying around all this baggage from our evolutionary past. The environments we live in have changed so much, but our brains haven't quite caught up.
It's like we're living in this high-tech world with, like, Stone Age brains.
Exactly. Think about how we crave sugary, fatty foods. Back in the day, those cravings were important, right? Helped us store energy when food was scarce. But now, with all this abundance, those same cravings can cause like obesity and all sorts of health
It's
problems.
a good reminder that understanding our evolutionary past can help us make sense of our struggles today.
Yeah, and it can also help us make better choices. If we know our brains are wired to respond to certain things, we can, choose to avoid them or at least change how we react.
It's like we're taking control of our own evolution.
Exactly. We're not just, passive products of our biology. We have the power to shape our own destinies, even if it's, within the framework of our evolutionary heritage.
That's pretty empowering. So what does all this mean for us going forward? If our behaviors are so deeply rooted in the past, can we actually change? Can
Yeah.
we, like, break free from those ancient patterns?
That's the big question, right? And I don't think there's a simple answer, but what evolutionary psychology gives us is a way to understand ourselves, our motivations, our limits. By recognizing those forces that have shaped us, we can start making, more conscious choices about who we want to be
Yeah,
and how we want to live.
like shining a light on the hidden wiring of our minds, giving us the power to, reprogram ourselves in a way.
Exactly. And while we might not be able to completely wipe out our evolutionary past, we can at least be aware of its influence and try to create a future that matches our values and what we want to achieve.
I like that. That's hopeful. It's been a really cool journey exploring the Red Queen with you. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive made you curious and maybe gave you some new insights into, what shapes our lives.
It's been fun. And remember, the evolutionary journey isn't over. It really makes you think about what the future holds for us.
Great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into evolutionary psychology. We'll catch you next time when we explore another fascinating topic.